Hello and welcome to Debating Europe's live stream event here in the European Parliament on who should decide what is acceptable online. My name is Joe Lidobarski. I'm the editor of Debating Europe and I'll be moderating this panel discussion today. And joining me to my left are Lorcan Price, who is legal counsel at ADF International. Beside him is Julia Moser, who's communication officer and hate speech advisor at SEIJI. To my right, we've got Benjamin Ledwan, who is head of Brussels office for Bitkom, which is an association representing German tech companies and digital companies, and then Eva Medel, who is a Bulgarian MEP with the centre-right European People's Party. So we've asked you to send in your comments and questions on this topic, on the topic of hate speech, moderation, what sort of content is acceptable and not online. I'd like to start off by putting a question from one of our readers to the panel and see where you draw your line, what you think is acceptable content online. This was sent in from Lubomir. Eva, I'd like to start with you. So Lubomir argues free speech shouldn't mean you can slander others, lie, misinform deliberately, or incite others to violence and bloodshed. So he's obviously saying there has to be a limit to freedom of speech somewhere. Presumably you'd agree, and where would you set that limit?
Well, first of all, it's an excellent question, I think, to kickstart the debate today, but it's also kind of the million-dollar question or the multi-billion-dollar question we have to pose ourselves. It's a very fine line, and it's something that I've been thinking quite a bit, because on one hand, we are aware that hate speech is what it is and it cannot be tolerated. But to what extent can we make sure that society, once somebody uses it, the content is brought down, how do we make sure that this is not re-uploaded? Or it's not just about uploading it online, or it's more about making sure that we tame ourselves a little bit and don't use this sort of expressions and hate speech. And it's something that is extremely difficult. This thing will be there to stay, probably. One can probably go back and argue it's part of our DNA to be aggressive, perhaps in one person more than in another. And so, as I said, it's so difficult to draw that line. What's important, I think, is once you've been there and you did it, to have some sort of repercussions so that this thing does not occur again. How this exactly will be done and should be done, I think we have plenty of actual experts that probably deal with this on a daily basis. So I'm also going to be curious to hear what steps we can take to help society produce more speech that we can argue and debate about, but less that is offensive.
Yes, well, I'd like to bring in Ben here, because your organization, obviously, for some of the internet platforms that you represent, will deal with this question about, online, what content is acceptable, where do we draw the line? So what would you say to the question from Lubomir here, or the comment from Lubomir?
Yeah, I think it's really an excellent question, because it brings us down to the core of the debate already, what is acceptable and what not. Before I get into the answer, maybe let me briefly introduce our membership, which is very broad. It's platforms, it's telcos, it's basically all the actors that are involved in the digital ecosystem. So, and that gives us a very good horizontal overview. Regarding the question, it is very interesting, because we believe that there is a line already there in a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy doesn't mean that you can say anything that comes to your mind. The line is the law, right? So that is the starting point. The thing about law is, of course, it can be interpreted. So and that is really our main point in this debate, that we should not leave the decision to automated systems or to decisions under very tight deadlines. Sometimes in an hour you have to decide something is illegal or not.
This is the case in Germany, is that correct? It needs to be within an hour.
Exactly. So we were quite instrumental on the Network Enforcement Act, that was a very controversial point. It has a very clear scope. It kind of limits it to very big platforms. And they now have to put mechanisms in place that users can notify if something is, in their opinion, hate speech, and then the service providers have to act, right? But what we were arguing strongly against was to leave that decision to automated systems, because a lot of these questions come down to interpretation. So it has to be a sort of competent state authority and lawyers that take that decision. Don't leave it up to private companies that are under a lot of pressure, because if they come up with a wrong decision, they have to pay a lot of sanctions. They're liable. So that's exactly our point. It will, in the end, lead to overblocking, because they don't want to be exposed to that threat.
That is very key to the debate. I think we'll come back to that, because I think that it's actually at the heart of what we're discussing here today. But first, I'll put the same question from Lubomir to Julia. What would you say? Where would you draw the line?
So where we draw the line when it comes to the Facing Facts online course that we developed on hate speech, specifically to teach people about how to counteract it, either through monitoring or through counter speech, is that freedom of speech is a super important and essential human right, but it's not an absolute one. So just as like I can extend my arm until it reaches your nose, it has its limits. And when it comes to also to criminal acts, to extortion, that's where freedom of speech stops to be protected. And this is where we kind of draw the line. So there are limits of freedom of expression, especially when it's often used to abuse others online, and also to exclude others from online discussions. So when it becomes a tool for exclusion, that is not okay anymore.
And so your organization, Seiji, is working with kind of countering discrimination, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and so on. So this is an issue that you're very much working on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, and it's the same. The same applies to the Facing Facts online course on hate speech. That we are focusing on all forms of discrimination and how to counter either hate crimes or hate speech. And I think what misses often from these conversations is that it's not just removal that's an option when it comes to these online phenomena, but also there's so much to do in forms of counter speech, in forms of counter narratives and alternative narratives, because they're slightly different. So there's plenty to do, but we need to educate people about these options so they can also take action, and we don't necessarily just only have to rely on social media companies or the government exclusively.
Interesting.
They all have to come together.
Okay. Lorcan, I'd like to put exactly the same question to you, I suppose. So where do you think the line should be drawn?
Well, it's a very good question, because the questioner raises a number of distinct issues. He talks about whether or not slander should be permitted, lies and misinformation, and then he talks about incitement to violence. And those are all quite distinct concepts, and the lawyer would tend to try and break those down and analyze them separately. But what struck me about the conversation thus far is that, starting with our friend, the MEP, and right away around, it seems that there's a degree of agreement as to what constitutes hate speech, and the comment was made, we're all aware of what hate speech is. In fact, I would dispute that, because the question of what constitutes hate speech is, in fact, a question that is very much contended and argued over before courts. For instance, my organization is currently involved in advising and consulting on a case that may go to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights as to whether or not certain remarks about Islam are part of an open debate in Austria, or whether they constitute hate speech in the sense that it hurts and offends religious feelings. And we've moved somewhat in Europe, I might suggest, from a position in the past where courts like the European Court of Human Rights held that a fundamental part of liberal democracy was ideas that shock and disturb as being part of the conversation, to now a sense where we're moving towards a greater level of censorship about what can be said online. I think a point of agreement on the panel would certainly be that incitement to violence, which is part of the question, is something that I think most right-thinking members of society would oppose because of the direct harms involved with it. But the more nebulous concept of hate speech, which has not been really well defined, and there are different standards around Europe as to what constitutes hate speech, raises a real problem with the way it's being enforced now, whether it be by algorithms or by greater intervention by internet and social media companies, as to a chilling out and a removal of legitimate points of view from the conversation in Europe because they upset certain people. And a remark was made by Julia here, which is that countering speech with speech, and I don't want to misrepresent what you say, but I would agree insofar as one of the ways that a free exchange of ideas happens in a society is that we counter speech with other speech. We not necessarily counter it in a liberal democracy with censorious mechanisms to remove speech from the public square or to penalise those who engage in speech that may well upset certain people.
I'm going to come to Julia. I'm going to ask you your response, but I want to put a question to you, Lorcan, from Wendy, because you mentioned a chilling effect. There's a chilling effect that can be where people feel that they don't want to contribute to a debate because they're worried that what they're saying might be misconstrued as hate speech or so on. Wendy argues that there is a chilling effect in the other way, in the other direction as well. She says social media should be a safe space where opinions can be freely expressed, so don't toxic comments and bullying create a sort of chilling effect, discouraging many people from exercising their freedom of speech. What would you say to that?
Well, one of the things, certainly, engaging in the public square, going out of your house in the morning, you're going to be confronted with ideas that upset you. The notion of a safe space, I think, can be extended unreasonably to constitute all forms of human communication. I mean, if you want to protect yourself from ideas that upset you, you certainly wouldn't leave your house ultimately. You would seal yourself off from discussion and dispute. One of the things that we have to accept in society is that we will be confronted with ideas that upset us. How we deal with that is the question. And I think once you start to allow powerful actors, like the government by using the force of the criminal law, or ever-increasing power of internet companies to start to decide using whatever means, be it active people or algorithms, to remove certain points of view from what is essentially the digital public square, then we have to raise real questions as to who decides whether or not these ideas are offensive. So I can accept Wendy's point insofar as it's not nice to be upset, but part of the human condition in a liberal democracy and the free exchange of ideas is to encounter things that upset you.
And Julia, this is exactly the question that we had from Eva, who decides? Who decides? Eva says, who decides what is hate speech and what is just critical comment? In other words, who decides what is unacceptable content online?
And let me connect the answer to that, to what Lorcan was saying, because I completely agree. There is a bit of confusion about what exactly hate speech is, and I think it's often misused, the term, because people are like, oh, I know what hate speech is. This is what someone says that they don't like me. No, that's not hate speech, and there are indeed plenty of different definitions. There is one legal one from the European Commission's framework decision of 2008 that says it's public incitement to hatred and to violence. So when it comes to hate speech and what we define as hate speech, I think it's safe to fall back on that definition and take hate speech as it is. It's true that when it comes to our work of education and anti-bias trainings, we use our definition that focuses more on a victim's perspective, because we believe that when it comes to hate crimes and hate speech, it's the victim that has to be put into the focus, because she or he is the person who suffers there. And there we try to also measure the potential harm that is there for the person. So it's slightly different, but yeah, there is a difference between criticism, between constructive criticism and clear hate speech and incitement.
Okay.
Can
yes,
I
Eva,
also
please.
add on that point, because we're currently working on actually a proper text, a legislative file, and I don't want to bother with the details, but we are exactly working on crafting the words on when it is about content, which is considered expression of opinion, which might sound as opposing, or as you said, you might not like it for one reason or another, but that does not mean necessarily that it incites violence nor hate, and it can remain online. And again, here I think the freedom of expression should not be hindered, but the challenge is that hate speech is illegal under a certain conditions present in different countries with a different text in a different way. So for platforms, in order to understand who posts it, from where do they post it, under different legislation, it's extremely challenging, I can assume. And this is why I think if we are to be able to align among the member states who enforce the law, these definitions might make it a little bit easier, but probably it's a very challenging thing to do.
I'm sure that you're going to want to come up back on that, Benjamin, but I'll first, Eva, if it's okay, I can put a comment to you from a user, Maricela, who argues that internet platforms should be fined if they don't implement a reporting system and immediately take action after getting justified complaints from other users. Maricela goes on, they should hire people if their AI is not capable to handle these bad comments. She's saying if automation is not, if the automation is a problem, as Benjamin was saying, then hire more people, human moderators. What do you think of Maricela's comment? Is that a sensible approach?
Yeah, well, I think it's extremely important to have the human factor as well as the AI, and I think it was mentioned also earlier by the other participants of the discussion. You cannot 100% rely on an algorithm. And sometimes it might be a lawyer that you might need to consult. Sometimes it might be a professional within your organization. But that's definitely something that has to be taken into consideration. And we as policymakers are taking that into account when we actually draft suggestions and legislation. I think at the beginning, even the statistics show that algorithm used to be for almost 90% of the cases of removing contact right, where now it's only about 60 to 70%, exactly because the algorithms make mistakes. So actually it has went down the way algorithms can understand. Probably because people who write it in a more sophisticated way, I don't know, or there's more content out there and it should be helpful to assess it, but that's what statistics show now. So actually the human factor is even more important today.
Okay, so Benjamin, platforms want consistency. Is that true? How would you respond?
Consistency is the key, right? So consistency is the key to know how you should react. I'd like to come back to your point, because I think it's a very interesting one, because you mentioned we first have to analyze and understand the problem at stake. And Bitkom, our association, they engaged already in 2015 with the question, what is hate speech and how does it impact, how is it dealt with? So from a very, very early stage. And what we found out, and it was really interesting, was that quite a few people, quite a high number of people, was affected by hate speech, either by reading comments or by being directly addressed. But there was a real difference in how they reacted depending on whether they were addressed directly themselves or whether they just read about it, right? And I think this is a really interesting conclusion, because it's easy to just read about it and then let it go and not react. But we should raise the awareness that if you read about it, then notify or react to it. So it's a lot about these civic engagements, civic initiatives that raise awareness, that foster literacy, media literacy, or digital literacy as we call it. That is the key. And then to really analyze what are the actual numbers, who is affected by it, what is the harm. So we have to sort of quantify it. So this roundtable approach of bringing together all the stakeholders is a really important one, it's a good one. We have to do it for all actors, not only the big platforms. Don't forget about the small platforms as well, because sharing of best practice is key, especially for them, because they might not have the capacities to actually.
But this is a voluntary.
That is very much.
That you're thinking of.
But I do see the role of the legislator there, because they can offer this sort of fora and bring together the stakeholders, and so that is really a good approach from our experience, and it's better as. I mean, what I call a little bit exaggerated, a legislative roundhouse kick by, reaching out to everyone and bringing companies in the scope that might not be affected by a certain problem, as with the terrorist content regulation that we might address later on. That's just maybe my remark to that.
Julia, we want to avoid a legislative roundhouse kick. Is that right?
Yes, so two remarks on both of your comments. So I completely agree. And I think one of the reasons why education and counter speech is so important, because it doesn't necessarily change the mind of the perpetrator, but it signals for others and that it's not okay, that certain content is not okay. So you kind of move from being an online bystander into taking action. And every time there is a discussion about whether algorithms and humans and how the two should be combined to remove hate speech effectively, I also agree that there there needs to be a combination, but I'm wary of the impact on the moderators when it comes to their daily job is to review all these materials. So it also has a human cost. So I think when it comes to hate speech, that's why we emphasize that it's not only the intervention that we need, but also the prevention part, and that happens in forms of education, media literacy on hate speech and counter speech.
But again, this is about improving education, but also it's a voluntary system you're thinking of. You wouldn't support, as our reader said, fines for platforms, kind of a 1 hour limit for taking down content. That you sort of support a kind of broader approach.
I'm afraid that would not result in in what we desire to see. I much prefer to support educational programs, and if these companies could engage more in the support of right educational programs of media literacy skills being taught either in schools or in Facebook. We have our message popping up on the top of our newsfeed saying like, oh, today the weather is going to be rainy. How about we put a message about being responsible when it comes to sharing content? That could also...
So it sounds like there's broad consensus in terms of hate speech. Well, you're making a face. Go on.
I disagree with that.
What would you say?
Well, it's fascinating listening to this discussion because we've leapfrogged entirely over the issue of what constitutes hate speech to technical solutions to what is perceived as hate speech. And I think there's a really serious problem with that, particularly with the Commission getting involved and the power that it has. I'm aware of the 2008 definition of hate speech, and I don't want to get too technical with it, but there's a real tension in that definition between incitement to hatred, which is an entirely subjective emotion, and then incitement to violence. Now, I come from I'm an Irishman, and I'm from the English legal tradition, and there was always a clear distinction between inciting someone to violence, which is instructing or encouraging or in other ways demanding of somebody or inducing them to commit violence against a certain person in a certain place, and this concept of hatred, which has ended up affecting everybody from cake bakers in Northern Ireland to hotel owners in England to politicians in Austria. And it's done in such a way and such a wide scope that it has, in fact, in the context of the discussion we're having in Europe about a range of issues from migration to tax policy to integration and everything in between, it has removed huge chunks of what were for a long time considered acceptable opinions from the public discourse. And I think that's a very serious problem, because if what you're doing is essentially using soft law instruments or technical regulations to make illegal large sections of public opinion, which you may disagree with, and you may disagree with them very instinctively, and they may upset you deeply, but to say that they're illegitimate and they constitute a crime, essentially, denudes the public square of opinions, while, as I say, might be very disagreeable, should be countered in other ways, such as through a conversation. And my fear is that the greater the extent of the censorship, the more these views will manifest themselves in different ways, in more radical ways. If you can disagree with something through a dialogue method, surely it's better than outlawing it and indeed requiring the platforms, the digital platforms, to be ever more aggressive in their removals. And I was looking at the report from the Code of Conduct published by the European Union here, and it's extraordinary the amount of content that has been removed is growing year on year. And this is something that the Commission has welcomed. I mean, I think we really need to pause here and ask ourselves the question, are we going down a route of censorship that ends up taking out perfectly legitimate points of view from the public conversation?
I think, I mean, the panel can correct me if I'm misinterpreting this, but I think that most people on the panel seem to be supporting industry, self-regulation, education, and not necessarily for hate speech. But I want to kind of talk to you about, you say incitement to violence is where you would draw the line, because there is a distinction, of course, between hate speech and terror content. So you have organizations like Islamic State putting forward propaganda videos, often inciting violence and so on, recruiting. Last week, we interviewed Gilles de Kerchove, who's the EU's counter-terrorism coordinator. And at the moment, there's something called the EU Internet Forum, which is an industry kind of meeting with government, and it's voluntary and so on. He said we've reached a limit with that process. He believes that it's not fast enough. He would like to see, and there is in fact terrorist content, the terrorist content regulation, which is going through the legislative process, which is about taking down content quickly, setting time limits and so on. Now, Benjamin, you mentioned it. I would like to ask you about it. What's your opinion on it? Your organization's opinion on this terrorism content regulation?
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. Before getting into the more technical side, I would just like to make clear from the very beginning that the question is not about do we tolerate terrorist content online or not. It's a very sensible question. Of course, no one does. The question is how do we deal with this content? And I would just like to highlight a technical aspect here, because if we read the Commission's proposal, the scope is extremely broad, right? It basically encompasses all hosting providers. That can be email services, social network. That can be basically websites with a commentary section, right? And if the proposal goes through as it stands, that would require that all these websites would have to implement the necessary infrastructure, and that could mean automated tools. That could mean people that are capable to make a decision whether something stays or not within 1 hour. And that is just not feasible for the small actors in the field. So what it would mean basically is that they would have to dock themselves to a larger infrastructure. So it would lead basically to a market concentration, because they wouldn't be able to implement that infrastructure, which would be illegal, so they have no choice. And that's, I think, a really important point to keep in mind. If it's one of the stated aims of the Commission to avoid that market concentration. And if we follow that path, then it will lead to that. And we had one remark saying that, okay, you can just do that. If you have a website, you can just leave your table next to you when you go to sleep, and then you get a call and you react immediately. But that's not good enough. That's not going to do it. So that is an important question to address.
Very important question. Eva, so we have Gilles de Kokova. He sits on the EU Internet Forum, so he feels that voluntary process, this sort of self-regulation process, has failed or has reached a limit, he says. Would you agree? Do you think that for when it comes to terrorism content, maybe not hate speech, but maybe terrorist content, that we need to have these kind of hard laws in place?
Well, yeah, actually the Commission, I think, asked around 300 companies what are they doing to tackle hate speech, and about 13 replied. So I guess we've reached that point, yes. I've always been a defender in the past years here in the Parliament of regulation for innovation. So if you would regulate, you better foster something good coming out of it, as well as for self-regulation where that's necessary and possible. Again, I don't know how things will play out. We are still debating, discussing, and figuring out the latest piece of text. But it's a very tricky thing, because we've seen how difficult it is to kind of do something about it. And 1 hour, especially for small players, to remove content is very short, one can argue. On the other hand, people would say, well, we are all connected, but maybe we can extend that to a couple of hours or something to enable smaller players to kind of be able to remove this content when that is necessary.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I want to very, very quickly go around the panel, because I think basically what we're talking about today is technology is moving at an enormous speed, an ever-increasing speed, and we're talking about the policy tools to kind of catch up with technology, basically. So I'd like to ask you, Lorcan, do you feel, and I'll ask all of you in turn, do you feel that we have the tools that we need? Are you happy with the status quo in terms of what we have? Or do you think we need to make changes?
Well, if you'll forgive me, I'll answer that by saying we need to decide first of all, what it is that we're prohibiting. So before we get to the technocratic solutions, which a lot of the conversation was taken up by, we have to decide whether or not, for example, the Dutch prosecutor's decision to investigate 200 pastors in the Netherlands for signing a statement about the traditional Christian view of marriage constitutes a hate crime. before we get to giving more power over to the Commission and various regulators to start banning certain types of speech.
But isn't there's a time pressure as well, because we're dealing with issues which, I mean, the legislation that we have in place is often for a decade old, and there's a legislation governing content online which was drafted before Google existed.
Yes.
And it's still on the books. So isn't there a kind of a time question? If we're having these sort of philosophical debates about what constitutes hate speech and so on, do we need to be having those debates faster? Are we having them at the right speed? Are you comfortable with...
Well, I hope your audience would agree with me that rushing into laws that are badly thought out before we even have the conceptual foundations agreed is a recipe for disaster, particularly across 28 jurisdictions, or 27 soon, maybe, that have very different philosophical traditions. I mean, the Irish and the British outlook on freedom of speech is different from Germany for all kinds of historical reasons. So, approaching this with a monolithic regulatory framework like we were discussing here today, to me seems misguided and will end up creating the kind of problems that I identified, such as chilling the freedom of Europeans to express perfectly legitimate points of view about things affecting their lives, even if those points of view shock us.
Okay, so Julia, we're right back at the very beginning of the debate. How do we define what hate speech is that right?
Right, yeah, but I think when it comes to content removal and moderation, we can look at the practical level and the role of moderators. We also need to reflect on the principles and the morality and the ethics behind the possible legislation that we might arrive to one day. And this is where I think we all have to come together from society, and governments need to take their role, and also IT companies, civil society, experts, academia, simply because it cannot be up to one single entity to do that. And it's also a question of trust. Do we trust social companies to do that? Not really. Do we trust our governments? Maybe some countries do, maybe in other countries it's less so. So it's a very, very complex question, but there needs to be an agreement at some point, and I agree that it's very urgent to do this, so because of what we see happening online these days.
Okay, we're out of time. I'll just give you both 30 seconds if you just very quickly want to say, is there anything you'd like to add, or you're...
Let me just wrap up by saying I would be strongly in favor of following that broad approach of bringing together actors from the public and private sector, from big platforms, smaller platforms, members from the whole ecosystems that are concerned. And to what Mrs. Maydell said, if there is then an obvious failure for a specific platforms where we have clear evidence that it's been hijacked, for example, for spreading terrorist content, then let's react to that. But let's avoid bringing in a whole range of companies that don't have that problem, but that then have to implement that infrastructure. That is not reasonable.
Okay, last word, Eva Maydell.
Lastly, I don't think we should leave citizens and people who are victims of hatred or violence speech over the internet to just wonder what's going to happen with me, so to say. And I think it's important to combine efforts with the policymakers, with as you said, not only legislation. It's not necessary to legislate, but also the people and the platforms who try to self-regulate. Every forum has a moderator, so to say. So let's make sure that we can find a way to collaborate. It's absolutely existential at this point, because it's unclear whether one can do it or another one can do it. In one country might work in one way and in another differently. So we have to combine the efforts and find the best solutions for the different markets and the different problems that would occur.
Okay, well, we're out of time now. If you'd like to continue the debate, you can do on our website, debatingeurope.eu. Thank you very much to the panel for taking the time to be with us today, and thank you for watching.